Nothing collapsed that night. No cities burned. No crowns fell. No one declared a new faith. The churches were still standing. The prayers were still spoken. But something had already shifted. Words were being read without permission. Meaning was forming without approval. And belief was beginning to answer to conscience instead of inheritance. By morning, the world would look the same. Yet the unity that had held Europe together for 1,000 years was already gone. This is not the story of a rebellion. It is the story of a silence that changed everything. If these quiet histories speak to you, you're welcome to remain here. New nights are added regularly. The night the Reformation began. Chapter 1. A world still whole. In the early 16th century, Western Europe did not experience belief as a landscape of choices. It experienced it as a shared space. Across kingdoms that spoke different tongues, across cities governed by different laws, there existed a single religious horizon. Not because everyone agreed on every detail, but because there was no recognized alternative. The same prayers marked the same hours. The same calendar organized the same year. The same authority framed the same understanding of salvation. A traveler could move from one region to another and recognize the structure immediately. The churches differed in stone and scale, but the order within them remained familiar. This continuity mattered. It allowed people to assume that faith was stable, portable, and universally understood. Belief did not change at borders. It did not require translation of meaning, only of language. In this world, Christianity was not one institution among many. It was the connective tissue of Europe itself. Kings ruled by it. Laws referenced it. Time revolved around it. To belong to society was to belong to the church. There were Jews, there were dissenters, there were communities at the margins, but the dominant structure remained singular. One church, one recognized path, one inherited understanding of how the world was ordered. This unity did not feel imposed. It felt natural, like geography, like weather. On this night, no one spoke of division. The map of belief appeared continuous, unbroken, and unquestioned. Western Europe, for the moment, still prayed as one. Within this shared space, authority did not compete. It concentrated. There was one church recognized as universal, not because it controlled every action, but because it defined every limit. Its authority did not end at city walls or bend to local customs. It extended across borders, linking distant regions through a single framework of meaning. Spiritual power and social order were not separate realms. They reinforced one another. Rulers derived legitimacy from the church. Courts acknowledged its judgments. Oaths were sworn in its name. Even where political power was divided, religious authority remained singular. The church did not need to appear everywhere at once. Its presence was embedded in structures that endured: laws, rituals, obligations, and expectations. It spoke through counsels rather than commands, through doctrine rather than decree. This made its authority feel older than any ruler and more stable than any crown. By the early 16th century, the church was the largest institution in Western Europe, holding land, wealth, and influence on a scale no kingdom could match. Yet this power rarely announced itself loudly. It was assumed. Most people did not encounter the church as an abstract authority. They encountered it as the final word on marriage, on inheritance, on forgiveness, on death. Disagreement existed, but it moved inward, not outward. Questioning doctrine meant questioning order itself. And order, in a world without alternatives, was not easily challenged. On this night, the church did not feel threatened. Its authority was not defended because it did not yet need to be. It stood as the unquestioned center, the point to which all belief returned and from which no sanctioned path yet diverged. For most people, faith was not something discovered. It was received. No moment marked its beginning. There was no decision to make, no threshold to cross. Belief arrived with birth and remained unquestioned through life. Children were baptized before they could speak. They learned prayers before they learned letters. Religion entered their lives not as instruction, but as atmosphere. It shaped the household, the village, the year. To believe was not an act of conviction. It was a form of belonging. Faith functioned as identity long before it became doctrine. It defined who a person was, where they stood in the world, and how they were seen by others. Leaving it was not a change of mind. It was a break with family, with neighbors, with memory. For this reason, belief rarely felt fragile. It was supported by inheritance, reinforced by repetition, and stabilized by expectation. The question was never, what do you believe? It was, where do you belong? Personal doubt existed, but it had no public language. There was no framework in which to express it without also expressing isolation. In a world where faith was inherited, certainty required no defense. The church did not ask individuals to justify belief. It asked them to live within it. On this night, faith remained collective. It passed from one generation to the next as naturally as land, as custom, as name. No alternative identity yet existed against which belief could be measured. For most of Western Europe, to be born into society was to be born into the church. And nothing, so far, had challenged that assumption. This inherited faith produced something quietly powerful: stability. Not the absence of conflict, but the absence of uncertainty about fundamentals. People disagreed about land, about taxes, about rulers and borders. They did not disagree about the structure of the world. Shared belief acted as a common reference point. It explained suffering. It justified authority. It promised order beyond the visible. In times of famine or illness, meaning was already prepared. In moments of death, ritual knew what to do. The church provided continuity where political systems often failed. Dynasties ended, borders shifted, laws changed. Faith did not. This constancy allowed society to absorb disruption without questioning its foundations. Even injustice could be endured if it fit within an accepted moral framework. Shared belief reduced the need for explanation. It replaced debate with assumption. People did not ask whether the world made sense. They asked only how to endure their place within it. This was not blindness, it was efficiency. A unified belief system minimized friction in a fragmented political landscape. On this night, Europe still rested within that shared understanding. The system worked because it had not yet been asked to justify itself. Stability did not come from perfection, but from agreement. and agreement, once woven into daily life, can feel indistinguishable from truth. By the early 16th century, the Church was not only a spiritual authority, it was a material one. Across Western Europe, vast stretches of land belonged not to kings, not to nobles, but to the Church. Monasteries held fields and forests. Cathedrals controlled vineyards, mills, and towns. Bishops administered estates that rivaled princely domains. This ownership was accumulated slowly, through donations, bequests, and pious obligation. Land given for the salvation of souls rarely returned to secular hands. Over generations, these gifts formed an economic foundation that few institutions could rival. The Church did not simply bless the harvest. In many regions, it owned it. Rents were paid to ecclesiastical landlords. Labor was owed to monastic estates. Tithes moved steadily upward, from village to diocese, from diocese to Rome. This material presence anchored religious authority in daily experience. Faith was not only heard from the pulpit, it was encountered in contracts, in obligations, in the distribution of land itself. The Church's wealth was not hidden. It was visible in stone walls, in cloisters, in granaries filled year after year. Yet this accumulation did not appear sudden or aggressive. It had grown alongside society, woven into its structure. On this night, the Church's economic reach felt ancient, normal, and secure. Its land was not seen as excess. It was seen as permanence. And permanence, in a world that valued continuity above all, was a form of legitimacy. This ownership translated into influence that extended far beyond belief. The Church shaped economies not by command, but by presence. Markets operated on land it controlled. Trade routes passed through its territories. Seasonal labor followed rhythms defined as much by religious obligation as by weather. Tithes were not symbolic offerings. They were a structured transfer of resources, collected regularly, expected universally. For most households, the Church was part of the economic horizon. It received payment, distributed aid, and provided employment. Monasteries fed travelers. Church institutions supported the poor, cared for the sick, and educated a limited few. This created dependence as much as devotion. Economic security and spiritual order were closely aligned. To belong to the Church was also to remain within a system of support. The Church did not replace local economies. It stabilized them. In regions where political authority shifted or weakened, ecclesiastical structures remained. They collected, recorded, and redistributed resources with a consistency that secular rulers often could not match. This reliability reinforced legitimacy. People trusted what endured. On this night, the Church's economic role felt inseparable from its spiritual one. It was not seen as interference. It was seen as structure, a presence that did not need to assert itself because it was already embedded in the way life continued. The Church's authority extended into areas most people encountered not as belief, but as regulation. Ecclesiastical courts operated alongside secular ones, often overlapping, sometimes outranking them. They ruled on marriage and annulment, on inheritance and legitimacy, on moral conduct and oaths. For many matters that shaped private life, the Church was the final jurisdiction. Its laws did not feel abstract. They determined who could marry, whose children were recognized, and which promises were binding before God. Alongside these courts existed a network of obligations that structured daily responsibility. Tithes were expected, not requested. Fees accompanied baptisms, weddings, and burials. Pilgrimages, indulgences, and offerings were woven into the economy of faith. These payments were rarely experienced as corruption. They were understood as participation. To give was to belong. To contribute was to remain within the moral order. Refusing to pay was not merely financial defiance, it was a signal of separation. Through courts and obligations, the Church regulated behavior without constant enforcement. Most compliance was voluntary, driven by expectation rather than fear. On this night, these systems functioned smoothly. Disputes were processed, records were kept, judgments were issued in familiar language. The Church did not need to raise its voice. Its authority was already encoded in the rules that governed everyday life. And because those rules had existed for generations, they felt less like control and more like the natural structure of how society operated. Because the Church stood at the intersection of belief, law, and livelihood, its authority rarely felt optional. There was no clear boundary where religious influence ended and ordinary life began. The Church marked time. It validated contracts. It recognized families. It recorded births and deaths. To step outside its authority was not a symbolic act. It meant losing access to the structures that made life legible. Without the Church, there was no universally accepted calendar, no recognized moral court, no shared language of legitimacy. This made dissent difficult even to imagine. Religious authority did not appear as coercion because it was embedded in processes people relied on. The Church did not need to demand obedience. Obedience followed from necessity. Its reach extended into moments of crisis as well as moments of routine. When illness spread, it offered explanation. When death arrived, it offered order. In a world without centralized states or uniform legal systems, this consistency mattered. It made the Church feel less like an institution and more like an environment. Something one lived within, rather than something one confronted. On this night, religious authority was not defended because it was not yet challenged. It was unavoidable precisely because it had never been presented as a choice. For most believers, authority did not have a face. The Pope existed, but rarely as a person encountered or imagined in detail. He was distant, geographically and conceptually. What mattered was not the individual, but the position. Papal authority functioned as an idea, abstract, elevated, and continuous. It did not depend on charisma, nor on visibility. Few people could name recent popes. Fewer still could describe their actions. Yet their authority was unquestioned. This distance strengthened legitimacy. Because authority was impersonal, it appeared permanent, unchanged by age, illness, or death. Popes came and went, but the office endured, and it was the endurance that mattered. Rome did not rule by constant instruction, it ruled by reference. Local clergy acted in its name. Bishops carried its legitimacy. Documents bore its seal. For most of Europe, Rome was not a city. It was a source, a point of origin for doctrine, law, and final judgment. This abstraction allowed papal authority to exist everywhere without being present anywhere. On this night, no one expected Rome to intervene. Its power lay precisely in the fact that it did not need to. The idea of authority was sufficient, and as long as the idea remained intact, the structure it supported appeared unshakable. Most obedience did not arise from encounter. It arose from assumption. Few people ever met a bishop. Fewer still stood before a papal representative. Yet compliance was widespread and habitual. Orders were not delivered personally. They arrived embedded in custom, repeated through ritual, reinforced by expectation. Authority moved downward without the need for explanation. Local clergy did not speak as individuals. They spoke as extensions of something larger. Their words carried weight because they were not perceived as personal opinion. This removed friction. There was no moment in which belief required confirmation. No confrontation between ruler and subject. No need to assert power directly. Obedience functioned quietly, through continuity rather than command. People followed rules not because they were watched, but because deviation had no recognized form. To obey was simply to remain within the world as it existed. Disobedience, by contrast, required imagination. It demanded the ability to conceive of life outside established order. For most of Western Europe, such imagination was unnecessary. On this night, obedience did not feel restrictive. It felt normal. Authority did not announce itself because it did not need to. Its presence was assumed in the same way one assumes the solidity of stone or the turning of seasons. And as long as obedience required no contact, authority remained distant, stable, and unchallenged. Distance did not weaken authority. It refined it. The farther power stood from daily life, the less it was questioned. Rome was not nearby. It did not intervene in small disputes. It did not correct every error. And precisely because of this, its authority felt larger than circumstance. Distance allowed power to exist without contradiction. Local failures could be blamed on individuals. Delays could be attributed to procedure. Silence could be interpreted as wisdom. The center remained untouched. This separation created a layered structure. Daily life operated close to the ground. Ultimate authority remained elevated, removed from the noise of ordinary decisions. People did not expect immediate answers from Rome. They expected continuity. And continuity does not require presence. It requires endurance. By remaining distant, authority avoided familiarity. And familiarity, over time, breeds evaluation. Instead, distance preserved reverence. Power was not measured against experience. It was measured against tradition. On this night, no one felt abandoned by authority's absence. Its distance was part of its design. The system functioned because the center did not interfere, and because no one yet believed that interference was necessary. As long as distance was interpreted as order, authority remained intact, unseen, unquestioned, and still whole. Because authority was distant, it did not need to justify itself. Legitimacy was inherited in the same way belief was inherited. It did not depend on persuasion or on visible success. The Church did not explain why it ruled. It simply had always ruled. This absence of explanation was not perceived as a weakness. It was understood as proof of stability. Institutions that must constantly explain themselves invite comparison. Institutions that do not are assumed to be beyond dispute. The Church's authority was anchored in time, not in performance. It traced its legitimacy backward through centuries of continuity rather than forward through outcomes. For most people, this made questioning unnecessary. Authority did not ask to be trusted. Trust was implied by longevity. If the Church had existed before one's grandparents, before written memory, before local tradition, then its right to define belief seemed unquestionable. On this night, no alternative framework existed against which legitimacy could be measured. There was no competing institution claiming equal authority over salvation, morality, and meaning. Without comparison, explanation was irrelevant. Power endured not because it persuaded, but because it preceded. And in a world shaped by inheritance, what precedes is rarely challenged. Knowledge was not absent. It was concentrated. Access to learning followed clear lines. Clergy, scholars, and a narrow urban elite stood closest to it. Most others remained outside by design. Universities existed, but they served a fraction of the population. Monastic schools trained those already destined for religious life. Instruction was not meant to circulate freely. This limitation was not always enforced. It was assumed. Learning required time away from labor, resources to support study, and entry into institutions that most people would never approach. For the majority, knowledge arrived secondhand, through sermons, through ritual, through accepted interpretation. This arrangement created clarity. Those who knew within boundaries. Those who did not were not expected to ask. The separation was not resented. It was practical. In a world where stability depended on continuity, widespread questioning was unnecessary. On this night, knowledge remained where it had always been, held by those assigned to hold it, filtered before it reached the rest. Distance preserved order, and order, as long as it remained unchallenged, felt like wisdom. The language of learning was not chosen for accessibility. It was chosen for continuity. Latin connected scholars across regions, linking distant universities, monasteries, and courts through a shared written tradition. This unity served authority well. Texts could travel without changing meaning. Doctrine could remain stable across generations. Interpretation could be confined to those trained to handle it. For most believers, however, Latin was not a language of understanding. It was a language of sound. Prayers were heard rather than read. Scripture was recited rather than examined. Meaning arrived through tone and ritual, not through comprehension. This distance was intentional. A sacred language preserved separation between the text and the listener. It marked knowledge as something to be received, not approached. Understanding was not required for obedience. Reverence was. On this night, Latin functioned as a barrier that few questioned. It protected doctrine from casual interpretation and reinforced the position of those who spoke it fluently. Authority spoke in a language that did not need to be understood to be accepted. And because that language had endured for centuries, its authority felt unquestionable. For the majority of believers, the sacred text was never encountered directly. Literacy was limited. Books were scarce. Scripture existed as an object heard, not held. The Bible was present in churches, but not in homes. It belonged to lecterns and altars, to libraries few would enter. Most people knew its stories through fragments, passages selected, arranged, and explained by others. This distance shaped experience. Faith was not built through personal reading. It was formed through listening, through repetition, through trust in those who spoke with authority. There was no expectation that a believer should consult the text personally. Such an act would have seemed unnecessary, even improper. Interpretation was a responsibility reserved for those trained to carry it. For everyone else, certainty came from consistency. The same verses, the same explanations, the same conclusions, year after year. On this night, Scripture remained something received, not examined. Its power lay in its permanence, not in its accessibility. And because few could read it for themselves, the text retained an aura of distance, protected from doubt by the simple fact that it was out of reach. In this world, understanding was not a prerequisite for faith. Obedience came first. Meaning followed at a distance. Believers were not asked to verify doctrine, to compare interpretations, or to trace arguments to their source. They were asked to accept what had already been decided. This arrangement did not feel restrictive. It felt efficient. Trust replaced analysis. Ritual replaced explanation. The church did not expect comprehension from everyone, because comprehension was not necessary for the system to function. Faith operated through participation, through presence, through repetition, to kneel, to listen, to observe the calendar. These acts were sufficient. The absence of understanding did not create anxiety. It created reassurance. If meaning belonged to trained authorities, then error could be avoided. Responsibility remained centralized. For most believers, this was a relief. They were not required to defend belief intellectually or reconcile contradictions personally. The burden of interpretation rested elsewhere. On this night, obedience felt lighter because it did not demand explanation. The world asked only that one remain within its structure, and as long as that structure held, understanding could remain distant without consequence. Unity carried a cost that was rarely named. It was paid quietly, over generations, in the narrowing of possibility. A unified world required agreement, and agreement required limits. Certain questions were never asked aloud, not because they were forbidden explicitly, but because they did not fit within the shape of accepted belief. Curiosity learned restraint. Doubt learned silence. The preservation of cohesion depended on the absence of divergence. Ideas that could not be reconciled with established doctrine were set aside, left unspoken, or redirected into safer forms. This was not always enforced through punishment. Often, it was achieved through expectation. To remain within the community meant learning which thoughts belonged inside and which did not. Unity simplified the world. It reduced uncertainty. It protected against fragmentation. But it also narrowed interpretation, limited imagination, and discouraged personal engagement with belief. The cost was subtle. It did not feel like loss because nothing visible was taken away. No rights were removed. No alternatives had ever been offered. On this night, that cost remained invisible. The world still functioned smoothly, precisely because the sacrifices required to maintain unity had long since been absorbed into what felt normal. Cohesion endured, not because it was without price, but because the price had been paid so gradually that few remembered it had ever been a choice. Some questions existed only in private thought. They were not dangerous by nature. They were dangerous by implication. To ask why something was believed was to suggest that belief might require justification. To ask how authority was established was to imagine that it might be examined. Such questions had no public space. They were not debated in sermons. They were not addressed in councils. They were not framed as problems to be solved. The system did not suppress them directly. It rendered them unnecessary. If belief had always existed, then inquiry appeared redundant. If authority had always spoken, then questioning sounded like interruption. Over time, this absence of inquiry became habit. People learned not to ask because there was no language in which an answer could be given. Doubt did not lead to discussion. It led to isolation. Without a shared framework for questioning, private uncertainty remained private. And without visible disagreement, the appearance of unity remained intact. On this night, the questions that could not be asked were still contained within individual minds. They had not yet found words, audience, or permission. The silence around them was not enforced by fear, but by the simple fact that no path existed for them to travel. Slowness was not seen as a limitation. It was treated as a safeguard. Thought was expected to move carefully, measured against tradition, filtered through authority, and delayed when necessary. Speed suggested instability. Urgency suggested danger. The Church valued deliberation because deliberation preserved continuity. Councils took years to convene. Decisions took longer to announce. Change, when it came, arrived gradually. This pace was framed as wisdom. Truth, it was believed, did not require haste. What endured across centuries did not need to be reconsidered quickly. Slow thinking reduced error. It protected doctrine from impulse. It kept belief aligned with precedent. For the individual, this removed pressure. One was not expected to reach conclusions alone. Judgment belonged to institutions, not to private conscience. To think slowly was to trust that answers already existed and would arrive in due time. On this night, patience was still interpreted as faithfulness. Delay was not avoidance. It was respect. And because the system had always moved this way, slowness did not feel restrictive. It felt like virtue, a sign that the world was stable enough to wait. An unquestioned world feels complete because it does not ask to be tested. Its strength lies in familiarity, in patterns repeated often enough to appear permanent. But this permanence carries a cost that is difficult to measure from within. When belief does not require examination, it also resists renewal. When authority does not explain itself, it cannot easily adapt. The system gains stability, but loses flexibility. Unity depends on agreement, and agreement depends on limits. The narrower the limits, the more secure the structure appears. Yet within those limits, room for personal engagement remains small. Faith is preserved, but distance grows between belief and experience. Certainty is maintained, but curiosity finds little place to settle. This price is not paid all at once. It is absorbed gradually, becoming indistinguishable from the world itself. On this night, nothing felt constrained. The world still made sense. Its answers still arrived from above. Its order still appeared sufficient. But beneath that calm surface, the cost of unquestioned unity remained unresolved. Not yet visible, not yet urgent, only waiting for the moment when explanation would be demanded. Chapter 2. Words without permission. Change did not arrive suddenly. It began at the edges. By the early 16th century, the ability to read was no longer confined entirely to monasteries and universities. It was still rare, still uneven, still limited by region and class. But it was spreading. In towns, among merchants, clerks, and artisans, reading began to serve practical needs. Contracts, accounts, letters. Literacy did not appear as a threat, it appeared as utility. Learning to read did not imply learning theology. It meant navigating commerce, managing property, communicating across distance. Yet with reading came exposure. Those who could read at all were no longer entirely dependent on what was spoken aloud. Words could be encountered privately, at a chosen pace, repeated, considered. This shift was quiet. No institution announced it. No authority resisted it openly. There was no clear moment when literacy crossed a line. It simply widened. What had once been exceptional became, in certain places, unremarkable. The church remained the primary holder of texts, but it was no longer the only gatekeeper of reading itself. And reading, once learned for practical reasons, did not always remain practical. On this night, most of Europe still listened rather than read. But the circle of those who could approach words directly had begun, slowly, to expand. Not enough to challenge authority, not yet, but enough to alter how silence would be experienced when it finally arrived. Alongside this widening ability to read, learning itself began to move beyond its traditional walls. Education no longer belonged exclusively to monasteries and cathedral schools. In towns, children of merchants and officials learned letters for practical reasons. Not to interpret scripture, but to navigate contracts, inventories, and correspondence. This learning was modest. It did not aim at philosophy or doctrine. It aimed at usefulness. Yet it created a quiet shift. Knowledge was no longer acquired only within explicitly religious spaces. It entered homes, workshops, and counting rooms. Teachers appeared who were not clergy. Texts circulated that were not devotional. Reading became a skill, not a vocation. This separation mattered. Once reading was learned for one purpose, it could be applied to another. The boundary between sacred and ordinary knowledge became thinner, not by challenge, but by habit. No authority intervened. There was little reason to. These forms of learning did not question belief. They did not address doctrine. They did not seek reform. They simply existed alongside the old structures. On this night, education outside the church felt harmless. It supported commerce. It served administration. It improved efficiency. Yet it also introduced something new. The idea that knowledge could function without direct religious supervision. A small change, almost invisible. But once learning was no longer inseparable from faith, words began to travel with fewer restraints. This expansion did not move evenly. Literacy grew in pockets, not across entire kingdoms. Cities changed first. trade centres, university towns, places where distance mattered and writing reduced it. Rural regions remained largely unchanged. Life there still moved by memory and voice. Tradition was preserved through repetition, not through text. This imbalance shaped perception. What was ordinary in one place remained unimaginable in another. A merchant in a trading city might read letters daily. A farmer only a few miles away might never see a written page. Authority relied on this unevenness. Change that arrives gradually and unevenly rarely feels like change at all. There was no unified audience for new ideas, no single moment when awareness shifted collectively. Instead, understanding fragmented. Some people lived increasingly close to words, others remained distant from them. This prevented alarm. What appeared as possibility in one region felt irrelevant in another. On this night, the spread of literacy did not register as a transformation. It looked like variation, like local difference. And because it lacked uniformity, it lacked urgency. But uneven change has a quiet power. It creates spaces where assumptions begin to differ. Not everywhere at once, but enough to make silence noticeable when answers no longer arrive. As literacy widened unevenly, control weakened quietly. Knowledge did not escape its institutions all at once. It seeped. Texts were copied, borrowed, summarized. Ideas moved without their original context, without formal approval, without supervision. This did not resemble rebellion. It resembled circulation. Once reading existed beyond the walls that had traditionally contained it, containment became a matter of habit rather than certainty. A written page could travel farther than its author intended. It could be read without explanation. It could be revisited without guidance. The Church still oversaw doctrine. It still defined orthodoxy. But it no longer controlled every encounter between reader and word. This subtle loss of containment did not immediately threaten authority. It simply changed the conditions under which authority operated. Knowledge began to exist in places where correction was delayed or absent altogether. On this night, this shift did not appear dangerous. Nothing had been contradicted. Nothing had been challenged openly. But the system now depended not only on obedience, but on restraint. And restraint, once learned, cannot always be guaranteed. Words were still respected. Authority was still intact. Yet knowledge was no longer entirely enclosed. And what is no longer enclosed cannot remain unchanged forever. The change did not begin with the press. It passed through it. By the early 16th century, printing had already existed for decades. Its presence was familiar. Its novelty had faded. The press did not create new ideas. It altered the speed and scale at which existing ones could move. What once required years to circulate now required weeks. What once reached a handful of readers could reach hundreds. This acceleration did not announce itself as disruption. It appeared efficient, practical, economical. Printers did not see themselves as reformers. They were tradesmen. They responded to demand. Texts that found readers were reproduced again. Those that did not disappeared quietly. Authority was not immediately threatened because nothing fundamentally new had yet been said. The same doctrines were printed, the same prayers, the same commentaries. But the conditions of repetition had changed. Once a text entered print, It no longer depended on institutional copying. It no longer moved at the pace of scriptoria or clerical review. This did not break control. It thinned it. On this night, printing still appeared neutral. It served the old order, even as it quietly removed the friction that had once protected it. Words had not changed. Only their ability to travel had. And travel, once accelerated, rarely slows again. Speed altered perception before it altered belief. Texts began to move faster than response, faster than correction, faster than authority could comfortably follow. A sermon spoken in one town remained there. A printed page did not. It could be carried across regions, read by unfamiliar audiences, and interpreted without shared context. Ideas that once circulated slowly, tempered by time and distance, now arrived intact and immediate. This compression of time mattered. Readers encountered arguments before they encountered rebuttal. Questions reached new places before answers had been prepared. The traditional rhythm of doctrine statement, review, approval could not keep pace. This did not create disagreement instantly. It created exposure. People encountered perspectives they would never have heard spoken aloud, not because they sought them, but because circulation made them available. On this night, ideas were still familiar, but they were beginning to arrive without warning, without framing, and without guidance. Authority had relied on slowness to maintain coherence. Speed weakened that reliance, not by contradiction, but by arrival. Ideas no longer waited to be invited. They appeared. Once printed, a text no longer belonged to the institution that approved it. It belonged to the route it followed. Pages moved through markets, through inns, through private hands. They were folded, copied, shared, sometimes without attribution, often without context. No single authority tracked their movement. No central record marked who had read what or how it had been understood. This lack of supervision changed the relationship between word and reader. Texts could be encountered alone, without commentary, without correction. They could be read quickly or slowly, revisited or misunderstood. This freedom did not announce itself as danger. It felt ordinary. A page passed from one person to another did not carry a warning. It carried ink. On this night, most texts still aligned with accepted teaching, but the path they traveled no longer guaranteed alignment. Authority had once relied on proximity to interpretation. Printed words removed that proximity. What reached the reader was no longer accompanied by the voice that framed it. And when words arrive without supervision, meaning is no longer fixed. It waits, in the hands of whoever reads next. With supervision weakened, control shifted quietly. The church still defined doctrine. It still condemned error. It still named what was acceptable. But it no longer governed every moment of reading. A reader could encounter a text before encountering its interpretation. Meaning could form in silence. This reversal mattered. Authority had always assumed that explanation preceded understanding. Now, understanding could precede response. Institutions were built to manage ideas slowly, through review, through councils, through delay. Printed words did not wait. They reached readers before institutions could decide how they should be read. This did not immediately produce defiance. It produced independence. reading became an act less dependent on permission. On this night, control had not vanished, but it had become conditional. Authority could still speak, but it could no longer assume that its voice would be heard first. And once reading escapes institutional sequence, obedience must be re-earned, not yet challenged, not yet resisted, only quietly altered, by the simple fact that words had begun to arrive on their own terms. As reading became more common, attention shifted toward the source. Not toward sermons, not toward commentary, but toward Scripture itself. This interest did not begin as rebellion. It began as curiosity. Printed Bibles, excerpts, and paraphrases circulated more widely than before. They appeared in universities, in urban homes, in the hands of those who had never expected to hold them. For centuries, Scripture had been present without being approached. Now it was being noticed. Readers encountered familiar passages outside ritual context, without the cadence of worship, without immediate interpretation. This altered perception. Words once absorbed through repetition were now encountered through attention. They could be paused over, compared, remembered. The text itself began to matter in a new way, not because it said something new, but because it could now be revisited without mediation. On this night, most believers still trusted the church to explain Scripture correctly, but a growing number were beginning to look directly at the text, not to challenge authority, but to understand what had always been there. And understanding, once pursued, rarely remains passive. As interest in Scripture deepened, language became impossible to ignore. Latin preserved authority, but it limited reach. Across parts of Europe, texts began to appear in languages spoken at home: German, English, French, and others. These translations were not always complete. Some were partial, some unofficial, some circulated quietly. Their purpose was simple: to make the words understandable. This shift altered the relationship between believer and text. Scripture no longer arrived as sound alone. It arrived as meaning. Readers encountered passages without linguistic distance, without the protective barrier of an unfamiliar tongue. This accessibility did not immediately undermine faith. It intensified it. People read with reverence, not suspicion. Yet comprehension changed expectations. When meaning was clear, questions followed naturally. Not hostile questions, clarifying ones. Why this passage was emphasized, why another was not. Why interpretation mattered. On this night, vernacular Scripture was still rare, still uneven, still controversial. But once sacred words could be read in one's own language, they no longer belonged exclusively to those trained to interpret them. Language brought Scripture closer, and closeness, over time, reshapes authority. For the first time, reading became solitary. Scripture was no longer encountered only in communal spaces at fixed hours through a single voice. It could be read alone, in silence, at an unregulated pace. This privacy mattered. A reader could pause without interruption, return to a passage without instruction, notice details that sermons passed over. Meaning was no longer synchronized. Two people could read the same words and arrive at understanding at different times, or in different ways. This did not immediately divide belief. It individualized it. faith began to move inward. Responsibility for understanding shifted subtly from institution to individual. The act of reading alone did not feel radical. It felt intimate. Scripture became something one encountered personally, not only something one received. On this night, private reading was still limited, still cautious, still framed by respect for authority. But the experience itself had changed. When belief enters silence, it begins to answer to the reader as much as to the church. And once Scripture could be read privately, faith could no longer remain entirely collective. When Scripture could be read directly, mediation changed. The church did not disappear from interpretation, but it was no longer always present at the moment understanding began. A reader could encounter a passage before hearing how it was meant to be explained. Meaning formed in advance of instruction. This reversal was subtle but decisive. For centuries, interpretation had preceded exposure. Now exposure could precede interpretation. The text spoke first. This did not produce immediate rejection of authority. Most readers still trusted the church's explanations. But trust now followed experience rather than replacing it. Meaning felt personal before it felt official. Readers began to notice that understanding could emerge without guidance. Not necessarily correct understanding, but sincere understanding. On this night, this shift remained quiet. No doctrines were denied. No institutions were named as obstacles. But the role of mediation had changed. Authority was still present, still respected, still powerful. Yet it was no longer the only voice present when Scripture was read. And once meaning no longer requires mediation, authority must adapt or begin to wait. Once meaning could form without mediation, interpretation followed naturally. Readers did not set out to challenge doctrine. They set out to understand what they had read. Alone with the text, without immediate correction, conclusions began to emerge quietly. These conclusions were not proclamations. They were impressions, observations made in silence. A passage emphasized mercy where fear had been taught. Another spoke of faith where ritual had dominated. Such realizations were personal, often tentative, rarely spoken aloud. But they mattered. Interpretation no longer required authorization because it no longer required audience. It happened privately, beyond the reach of immediate response. This was not rebellion. It was reflection. For centuries, interpretation had been a public act, performed by those trained and appointed. Now it could occur in the space between reader and page. On this night, most readers still deferred to authority, but deference followed thought, rather than replacing it. And once conclusions can be drawn alone, authority is no longer the beginning of understanding. It becomes the reply. What followed this private interpretation was not confrontation, but delay. There was no voice present to correct the reader at once. No sermon intervened. No authority responded in the moment. This absence mattered. For the first time, an interpretation could exist without being immediately classified as right or wrong. Errors were not identified. Questions were not resolved. Understanding remained provisional, but provisional meaning still shapes belief. Without immediate correction, ideas had time to settle. They were considered, returned to, compared with other passages. The silence following interpretation allowed confidence to form quietly. Not certainty, but familiarity. Readers grew accustomed to thinking without interruption, to holding conclusions without requiring approval. On this night, this absence of correction did not yet appear dangerous. No one had declared dissent. No doctrine had been denied publicly. But authority had always relied on speed of response to maintain coherence. Correction delayed is authority deferred. And once interpretation exists long enough to feel stable, it becomes harder to remove. Not because it is true, but because it is already there. As interpretation remained uncorrected, faith began to move. Not outward, not into public declaration, but inward. Belief, once anchored primarily in shared ritual and collective affirmation, started to take shape within individual conscience. This shift was not announced. It was felt. Readers measured what they read against what they had been taught. Not to reject instruction, but to reconcile it. Where harmony existed, faith felt strengthened. Where tension appeared, it lingered. Belief became something carried privately, not only performed publicly. This inward movement changed responsibility. Faith was no longer sustained solely by participation in communal forms. It required personal engagement, however quiet. For centuries, salvation had been understood as something administered. Now it began to feel, for some, like something examined. On this night, this inward turn did not divide communities. It did not alter worship. It did not demand recognition. But it altered expectation. Faith was no longer entirely external. It was no longer upheld only by repetition and authority. It began to reside within the individual, fragile, thoughtful, and increasingly aware of itself. And once belief becomes inward, it cannot be managed in the same way again. As faith moved inward, conscience followed. For the first time, belief was felt not only as obedience, but as responsibility. Readers began to sense that understanding carried weight, that what one believed was no longer determined entirely elsewhere. This did not produce confidence. It produced unease. If meaning could be grasped personally, then error could be personal as well. Salvation could no longer be assumed to flow automatically through participation alone. Conscience emerged not as rebellion, but as awareness. An awareness that belief required attention. That silence from authority did not absolve the individual from thinking. This shift altered the moral balance. Responsibility moved subtly downward, from institution to person. Not fully, not officially, but enough to change how faith was felt. On this night, conscience had no public role. It issued no demands. It claimed no authority. It simply existed, quietly, uneasily, within those who had begun to read and reflect without permission. And once conscience becomes part of belief, obedience alone is no longer sufficient. Faith begins to answer not only to authority, but to understanding. The change did not go unnoticed. Within the church, differences were seen long before they were acknowledged publicly. Reports arrived from universities, from monasteries, from bishops attentive to shifts in tone rather than open dissent. Questions were circulating, not accusations, but variations. The same texts were being read, yet conclusions were beginning to differ. Not enough to fracture unity, but enough to register. This awareness did not provoke alarm. Institutions built on centuries of continuity do not react quickly to subtle change. Difference at first appeared manageable, local, academic, contained. The Church had always accommodated debate within defined boundaries. Disagreement did not automatically imply division. On this night, authority recognized variation without naming it a threat. No warnings were issued, no declarations made. Awareness existed quietly, circulating within correspondence and private discussion. The system knew that something was shifting. It simply did not yet know whether it required a response. Awareness did not lead to action, not immediately. The Church was accustomed to time. It had learned to trust delay as a form of control. Councils were not called quickly. Statements were not rushed. Judgment was expected to arrive only after careful consideration. This slowness had once preserved unity. Now it created distance. Questions continued to circulate while responses remained internal. Readers waited. Clergy hesitated. Authority chose patience over interruption. In part, this was confidence, a belief that variation would resolve itself through existing structures. In part, it was caution. To respond too quickly risked acknowledging a problem that might otherwise fade. On this night, silence was interpreted as stability. Nothing had been condemned. Nothing had been corrected publicly. But delay created space. And space allowed interpretations to continue forming without guidance. Authority remained intact. Its voice was still expected. Yet each unanswered question made the silence more noticeable. And silence, once noticed, begins to carry meaning of its own. Silence was not absence of concern. It was calculation. To respond publicly was to acknowledge that a response was needed, and acknowledgement carried risk. If authority spoke too soon, it might grant legitimacy to questions that had not yet demanded it. If it named disagreement, it might give it shape. For centuries, unspoken doubts had dissolved through neglect. They had faded without recognition. Authority relied on this pattern. Naming dissent transformed it from private uncertainty into public position. On this night, the Church chose not to name. It avoided language that would define the boundaries of dispute. It withheld judgment in the hope that variation would remain temporary, academic, containable. This restraint was intentional. By not speaking, authority preserved the appearance of unity. Yet restraint carried consequence. Those who waited for guidance received none. Those who questioned found no answer. Silence, intended to prevent division, began to suggest hesitation. And hesitation, once perceived, alters trust. The fear of legitimizing dissent kept authority quiet. But in that quiet, interpretation continued, unanswered, uncorrected, and increasingly aware of its own persistence. What appeared as hesitation was, in fact, familiar practice. Silence had long been one of the Church's tools. When authority remained quiet, it signaled confidence. It suggested that nothing essential had been disturbed. By refusing to react, the institution framed change as unworthy of response. This strategy had worked before. Ideas ignored often withered. Debate denied an audience lost urgency. Silence preserved hierarchy by keeping authority above reaction. On this night, The church relied on that inheritance. It waited, not out of ignorance, but out of trust in endurance. Yet the conditions had changed. Silence once assumed that ideas moved slowly, that access remained limited, that interpretation required permission. Now words travelled faster. Readers were more numerous. Understanding formed privately. Silence no longer fell on empty ground. It fell into minds already occupied by text. What had once dissolved quietly now remained, unanswered. And in remaining, silence ceased to be neutral. It became a presence of its own, felt, measured, and quietly weighed against the words that continued to circulate without reply. On this night, authority still believed that silence would preserve order. It did not yet see that silence itself had begun to speak. Chapter 3. Unity begins to fracture. When silence persisted, difference did not announce itself. It accumulated. The words were the same, the passages unchanged, the authority still intact. Yet understanding began to diverge. Readers approached familiar texts from different places, with different questions, at different moments. A verse emphasizing grace felt central to one reader. Another lingered on obedience. Another noticed absence. What was not said, what was assumed. None of these readings declared themselves correct. They existed quietly, side by side, unaware of one another. For centuries, interpretation had moved through a single channel. Now it moved through many, uncoordinated, unseen. This did not yet divide communities. It divided experience. Two people could attend the same service, hear the same sermon, and carry away different centers of meaning. The text had not changed. The framework around it had. On this night, unity still appeared intact, but it rested on a shared assumption that understanding was uniform. That assumption was no longer secure. The fracture did not begin with disagreement. It began with variation. Quiet, personal, and unnoticed by those who still believed that words spoke with one voice. As meanings multiplied, their center began to fade. For generations, interpretation had flowed outward from recognized authorities. Doctrine moved from councils to pulpits, from pulpits to the people. Now that movement was no longer singular. Interpretation did not disappear from institutions, but it no longer arrived first. Readers encountered Scripture before encountering its explanation. Understanding formed before alignment could be restored. This altered the structure of authority. There was still a center, but it no longer stood alone. Its voice entered a space already filled with other readings, other emphases, other conclusions. Without a single interpretive source, agreement required effort rather than assumption. Uniformity could no longer be taken for granted. It had to be maintained. On this night, no authority had been rejected, no council overruled. But the idea that one explanation would naturally prevail had begun to weaken. Interpretation had not rebelled, it had dispersed. And once meaning no longer gathers at a single point, unity becomes a task, not a condition. As interpretation dispersed, truth began to change its shape. It did not multiply into contradiction, it divided into emphasis. What had once been held as a single, unified understanding now appeared as a set of closely related positions. Each claimed fidelity to the same text. Each appealed to Scripture. Each believed itself aligned with tradition. Difference did not yet feel like opposition. It felt like variation within a shared faith. But variation altered expectation. If multiple interpretations could exist without immediate correction, then truth no longer arrived as a single voice. It arrived as agreement among some, hesitation among others. For centuries, truth had been something received. Now it began to feel like something weighed. This did not produce certainty. It produced responsibility. Believers became aware that understanding might depend on where one stood, what one read, and which passages were held closest. On this night, plurality was still subtle. No one spoke of separate churches. No one named divisions. But the idea that truth could be expressed in more than one faithful way had quietly entered belief. And once truth becomes plural, unity can no longer rest on silence alone. The change did not announce itself with statements or confessions. There were no formal breaks, no public renunciations, no visible lines drawn. Difference existed without declaring itself difference. People continued to worship together. They followed the same calendar. They spoke the same prayers. Outward unity remained intact, but inwardly, meaning had begun to separate. Believers carried their understanding quietly, often assuming it was shared. They did not yet recognize that others were reading differently. This made division difficult to see. Disagreement did not take the form of argument. It took the form of silence. Questions were held privately. Convictions remained untested. On this night, unity fractured without sound. No authority was confronted. No institution was challenged openly. Yet the shared assumption that belief meant the same thing to everyone present was no longer secure. Difference had arrived without permission and without declaration. And what enters without declaration is often hardest to contain. The first visible changes were minor. They did not challenge doctrine. They did not alter structure. They adjusted emphasis. In some places, sermons grew longer. In others, they grew simpler. Certain prayers were explained more carefully. Others were repeated less. Nothing was removed outright. Nothing new was formally added. The service remained familiar enough that few noticed the difference. Yet attention had shifted. Where ritual once stood at the center, meaning began to draw closer. Words were lingered over. Scripture was referenced more directly. The act of listening became more intentional. These adjustments did not require permission. They did not contradict instruction. They reflected local judgment. On this night, worship still followed the same outward form. But within that form, priorities were beginning to vary. And variation, once practiced repeatedly, becomes expectation. The service remained the same. What people listened for had begun to change. As practices adjusted, attention followed. Ritual remained, but it no longer carried the entire weight of faith. Gestures were still performed. Prayers were still spoken. The calendar still governed the year. Yet for some, these forms began to feel incomplete without understanding. Meaning moved closer to the center. Worshippers listened not only for familiarity, but for explanation. They noticed how words were framed, which passages were chosen, what was clarified, and what was left unspoken. Ritual had once required participation. Now it invited reflection. This shift did not reject tradition. It reoriented it. Faith was no longer sustained solely by doing what had always been done. It increasingly asked to be understood. On this night, this change remained gentle. No ceremony was abandoned, no authority dismissed. But emphasis had moved. Ritual, once sufficient on its own, now shared space with the demand for meaning. And once meaning becomes central, form alone can no longer carry belief unchanged. As emphasis shifted, uniformity weakened quietly. What had once been identical from town to town began to reflect local judgment. A service in one city no longer sounded exactly like a service in another. The structure remained recognizable, but the balance within it differed. Some communities lingered on scripture. Others emphasized moral instruction. Some reduced ceremonial detail. Others preserved it carefully. None of these variations were announced as alternatives. They emerged through repetition. What worked locally was repeated locally. What felt meaningful was retained. What felt distant was shortened or softened. Over time, these differences became familiar. Worshippers grew accustomed to how faith sounded where they lived. Travelers noticed contrasts, but rarely named them as significant. Local variation did not yet imply division. It implied adaptation. On this night, no one believed that unity had been lost. The church still stood. Doctrine remained unchanged. Yet practice had begun to reflect place. And when belief is shaped locally, shared experience becomes less predictable. Uniformity does not vanish at once. It erodes through acceptance, one familiar difference at a time. These changes were never announced. No letters were read aloud. No instructions revised. No authority issued clarification. The church did not declare that worship should change. It simply allowed variation to remain unaddressed. This absence of declaration mattered. Without official language, difference did not appear as dissent. It appeared as custom. Practices shifted quietly, protected by familiarity. What had been adjusted gradually felt traditional, once repeated often enough. People did not ask whether their local practice was correct. They asked whether it felt faithful. And feeling, once accepted as a guide, does not require endorsement. On this night, unity still existed on paper. Canon law remained unchanged. Doctrine stood intact, but lived experience no longer matched uniformly. Faith was being practiced in slightly different ways, for slightly different reasons, without anyone formally acknowledging the change. Difference had entered worship without permission and without resistance. And because no statement named it, no statement could yet contain it. As meaning moved closer to the listener, the role of the priest began to shift. He remained central. He still spoke from the pulpit. He still guided ritual and instruction. But he was no longer the only voice through which Scripture was encountered. Some worshippers arrived having already read. Others carried questions formed in private. The sermon no longer introduced the text. It responded to it. This altered the balance quietly. The priest was still respected, but interpretation was no longer experienced as something that began and ended with his words. Authority became dialogic, even when no dialogue occurred. Listeners compared what they heard with what they had read. Agreement strengthened trust. Difference introduced distance. The priest did not lose authority all at once. He lost exclusivity. On this night, this change was subtle enough to pass without confrontation. The structure of worship remained. The hierarchy stood. Yet interpretation no longer belonged to a single position alone. And once authority is shared, even silently, it must compete with understanding that forms elsewhere. As exclusivity weakened, trust began to move. Not away from the church entirely, but toward the words themselves. Scripture, once encountered mainly through institutional voice, now appeared as a stable reference independent of delivery. Readers noticed that the text remained when interpretations differed. Sermons varied, emphases changed, local practice adjusted. The words on the page did not. This constancy mattered. Trust, once anchored primarily in the institution that mediated belief, began to rest more heavily on the text believed to contain it. Authority no longer derived solely from position. It derived from alignment. Interpretations were weighed against Scripture, not accepted automatically because of their source. This did not yet undermine the Church's role. It redefined it. Institutional authority became persuasive rather than assumed. On this night, most believers still trusted the Church deeply, but they trusted it best when its words matched what they had already read. The center of confidence had shifted slightly, from office to text, from inheritance to recognition. And once trust begins to move, it rarely returns unchanged. As trust shifted, structure followed. The Church had long functioned through a clear vertical order. Authority moved downward. Obedience moved upward. This arrangement depended on the assumption that interpretation originated at the top. Once that assumption weakened, the structure did not collapse. It loosened. Authority still existed, but it no longer traveled along a single path. Understanding now formed at multiple levels before reaching institutional voice. This altered expectation. Believers listened, but they also evaluated. They compared. They measured. The vertical line between doctrine and devotion became less rigid. Guidance was still sought, but it was no longer unquestioned by default. On this night, the hierarchy remained intact in form. Bishops still governed. Priests still instructed. Rome still stood above all. Yet the flow of influence had begun to change direction. Understanding no longer moved only downward. It moved inward and outward as well. And when structure depends on exclusivity, any sharing of authority, however quiet, inevitably weakens its hold. As structure loosened, responsibility shifted. Faith could no longer rely entirely on inherited certainty or institutional assurance. Belief began to feel like something one carried personally, not simply something one participated in. This change was unsettling. If interpretation could differ, then certainty could not be assumed. If authority could be evaluated, then obedience required judgment. Responsibility moved inward. Individuals became aware that belief involved choice, not necessarily between institutions, but between understandings. This awareness did not empower, it burdened. The comfort of unquestioned authority gave way to the anxiety of discernment. For centuries, faith had been sustained collectively. Now it asked for individual attention. On this night, this responsibility was still unnamed. No doctrine required it. No confession demanded it. but it was felt in the quiet space between text and conscience. And once faith becomes a personal responsibility, it can no longer be governed solely by external structure. Authority may guide, but it can no longer carry belief alone. As responsibility moved inward, belief could no longer remain automatic. For the first time, faith required decision. Not a public declaration, not a formal break, but an internal alignment. Believers began to sense that understanding demanded consent. That participation alone was no longer sufficient. To believe meant to accept, consciously, what had once been assumed. This decision did not present itself as a single moment. It unfolded gradually, often unnoticed by those experiencing it. A reader lingered on a passage. A listener weighed a sermon. A conscience hesitated. None of this resembled choice as later generations would understand it. There were no options laid out side by side. Yet the act of deciding had begun. Belief was no longer guaranteed by birth, by custom, or by silence. It asked for agreement. On this night, this demand remained quiet. No authority required a decision. No institution acknowledged it. But within the believer, faith had crossed a threshold. It no longer rested solely on what had been received. It rested increasingly on what had been accepted. And once belief requires decision, unity cannot rely on inheritance alone. With decision came uncertainty. If belief required acceptance, then it also carried the possibility of error. For generations, faith had offered protection from doubt. Correct belief was guaranteed by obedience and participation. Now that guarantee weakened, believers began to feel the weight of being wrong. Not wrong in public, but wrong before God. If interpretation mattered, then interpretation could fail. If conscience played a role, then conscience could mislead. This anxiety did not surface as fear. It surfaced as hesitation. People listened more carefully. They reread passages. They compared what they heard with what they had read. Faith no longer felt effortless. It asked for attention, for discernment, for internal agreement. On this night, no one spoke openly about choosing between beliefs. There were no alternatives yet named, but the idea of correct faith had entered the private imagination. And once belief carries the risk of error, authority must offer reassurance or risk losing certainty. The anxiety of choosing had begun, quietly and without resolution. For centuries, salvation had felt assured through belonging. To remain within the church was to remain within grace. The path was clear, protected by ritual and authority. As belief moved inward, that assurance weakened. If faith required understanding, then salvation could no longer rest solely on participation. The question shifted quietly from "Do I belong?" to "Do I believe rightly?" This was not a theological declaration. It was a personal unease. Believers began to sense that no institution could fully guarantee what now depended on conscience. The church still promised salvation. Its sacraments remained unchanged. But the feeling of certainty no longer arrived automatically. Responsibility and risk had entered belief together. On this night, no doctrine had withdrawn assurance. No authority denied grace. Yet the universal guarantee, the confidence that salvation followed naturally from membership, had begun to feel conditional. And once salvation appears conditional, faith can no longer rest entirely on structure alone. It must answer, at least in part, to the individual who believes. As assurance weakened, responsibility stood exposed. Believers could no longer rely entirely on the church to carry the weight of belief for them. Institutional certainty still existed, but it no longer settled every question. Faith required engagement without full reassurance. This was not freedom, it was vulnerability. To believe without absolute certainty meant accepting the possibility of doubt as part of devotion itself. The church continued to speak with confidence and authority. Its structures remained unchanged. Yet for some, that confidence no longer resolved the questions that had moved inward. Responsibility was now lived in the absence of complete institutional guidance. On this night, this condition remained unnamed. No one described it as crisis, but it marked a turning point. Belief was no longer protected entirely by belonging. It was sustained by attention, by conscience, and by personal resolve. And once responsibility exists without guaranteed certainty, faith cannot return to its earlier simplicity. The fracture had not become visible, but it had become internal. By this stage, unity still existed in name, but no longer in experience. Western Christianity remained one institution, one hierarchy, one outward form. Yet beneath that surface, belief had begun to separate. Not into factions, not into movements, but into understandings that no longer aligned automatically. People prayed together while carrying different assumptions. They followed the same calendar while interpreting its meaning differently. Uniformity had depended on shared certainty. That certainty was no longer shared. This did not appear as collapse. It appeared as drift. No single moment marked the change. No declaration announced it. But the idea that Western Christianity functioned as a single, internally consistent faith had quietly ceased to be accurate. On this night, unity still described the structure. It no longer described belief. The church had not split. The world had not changed visibly. Yet the condition that made unity possible, a shared, unquestioned understanding, was no longer present. And once unity depends on agreement that no longer exists, it survives only as form. As shared understanding dissolved, identity began to reorganize. Believers no longer defined themselves only by belonging to the church. They began, quietly, to define themselves by emphasis. Some spoke more often of faith, others of obedience. Some returned repeatedly to Scripture, others to tradition. These distinctions were not yet names. They were tendencies. People recognized themselves in certain ways of believing, even before those ways were formalized. This was the beginning of confessional identity, not as membership, but as alignment. Belief became descriptive, not who I obey, but how I understand. On this night, no one introduced new confessions. No categories were announced, but the ground was prepared. When belief is no longer uniform, identity seeks new anchors. And when identity shifts inward, it eventually seeks language. Confessional identity did not arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, out of repeated emphasis, out of shared understanding, out of recognition rather than decree. The church still stood whole, but beneath it, new lines of belonging had begun to form. quietly and without permission. As these new alignments took shape, unity began to recede into memory. It remained present in language, in law, in ritual. People still spoke of one church, one faith, one Christian world. But this unity was no longer experienced in the same way by those who lived within it. What had once been immediate became historical. Unity was remembered as something inherited, something that had existed fully in the past, even as it continued formally in the present. Believers compared what they experienced with what they had been told once existed. The difference was subtle, but it was felt. Worship still gathered communities together. Authority still issued guidance. The calendar still marked the year. Yet the sense of shared meaning, the feeling that belief was held identically by all who stood together, had faded. On this night, unity survived as reference rather than reality. It was invoked, but no longer inhabited. And once unity must be remembered instead of lived, it becomes vulnerable. Not to sudden collapse, but to gradual replacement by new forms of belonging that reflect how faith is actually experienced. The world had not divided openly, but the age of unquestioned religious uniformity had quietly passed. Once unity had shifted from experience to memory, it could not be restored by decree. What had changed was not structure, but perception. Believers no longer approached faith from the same starting point. They did not hear the same meanings, even when hearing the same words. Attempts to reassert uniformity met a quiet resistance, not of rebellion, but of incompatibility. The old assumptions no longer aligned with lived understanding. Unity had once relied on silence, on distance, on the absence of choice. Those conditions no longer existed. Knowledge had widened. Interpretation had dispersed. Conscience had entered belief. To return to sameness would have required forgetting what had already been seen, read, and understood. On this night, no one yet spoke of irreversibility, but the path backward had already closed. The world could still remember what unity had been. It could no longer inhabit it. And when sameness becomes impossible, history does not turn back. It moves, quietly, unevenly, and without permission, into something new. But Chapter 4. No declaration, no return. What followed did not begin with an announcement. There was no night when a single decision altered the world. No bell that marked a before and an after. No universal recognition that something irreversible had begun. The Reformation did not arrive as an event. It emerged as a condition. Change unfolded through accumulation of readings, of interpretations, of unanswered questions. Each step appeared modest. Each moment felt local. Nothing demanded the weight of history as it occurred. Later generations would search for a beginning. They would point to documents, to figures, to dates that offered clarity. But those living through the change experienced none of this certainty. They lived inside a gradual shift whose direction was not yet visible. On this night, the world still looked familiar. Churches stood. Rituals continued. Authority spoke with confidence. Yet beneath this continuity, assumptions had already changed. The Reformation did not break the past. It loosened it. And once loosened, the world could no longer return to its earlier tension. History often announces itself only after it has already passed. This was such a moment, not defined by action, but by the quiet realization that what once held everything together no longer did. Because change unfolded gradually, it left no single moment to remember. There was nothing to witness, nothing to mark, nothing that demanded immediate recognition. Life continued. People went to church. They observed the calendar. They listened, prayed, and worked as they had before. If asked, most would have said that nothing essential had changed. History did not announce itself with rupture. It passed quietly through ordinary days. This absence of a defining moment made the transformation harder to resist. Without a clear beginning, there was no clear point of refusal. No moment at which authority could say, "This is where it starts." Each shift could be dismissed as temporary. Each difference explained as local. Change advanced because it did not demand attention. On this night, nothing appeared to require response. The lack of drama was its protection. What cannot be clearly identified cannot be clearly opposed. And so the Reformation moved forward without a moment that could be reversed. Not because it was hidden, but because it was everywhere and nowhere at once. Those living within the shift did not recognize it as transformation. They experienced it as adjustment. Only later would the pattern become visible. When differences could be traced backward, when causes were sought, when continuity could no longer explain the present. At the time, each change appeared reasonable on its own. A sermon emphasized scripture more clearly. A reader asked a careful question. A local practice adapted to local understanding. None of these felt decisive. History, however, does not measure significance by intention. It measures by accumulation. What could not be seen from within became clear only after distance was gained. Generations later, scholars would reconstruct timelines, identify origins, and argue over beginnings. Those arguments did not exist on this night. People did not feel that they stood at the threshold of a new age. They felt that they were responding to circumstances as they arose. This delayed recognition made reversal impossible. By the time change was named, it had already settled. On this night, history had not yet chosen its language, but the conditions were already in place for the past to be divided into a before and an after. Recognition would come later. The change itself had already happened. When the shift could no longer be ignored, authority responded in the language it knew best. Councils were convened, statements were drafted, boundaries were clarified. The Church had always relied on councils to address uncertainty. They were instruments of unity, designed to restore coherence when interpretation threatened to diverge. Condemnations followed deliberation. Ideas were named. Positions were defined. Certain interpretations were declared unacceptable. This response was measured, formal, and grounded in tradition. It assumed that clarification would resolve confusion, that once boundaries were redrawn, belief would return to alignment. But councils addressed doctrine, not experience. They spoke to authority, not to conscience. On this night, these efforts appeared necessary and justified. They followed familiar patterns. They reaffirmed continuity. Yet the conditions that had once made such responses effective had changed. Interpretation no longer waited for institutional resolution. understanding had already formed elsewhere. The church spoke, but it no longer spoke into silence. And when authority arrives after meaning has settled, its words can define limits, but they cannot restore the certainty that existed before those limits were needed. By the time responses were formalized, they arrived into a changed world. Authority spoke with clarity, but clarity no longer guaranteed alignment. Declarations followed developments that had already taken root. Condemnations addressed positions that had already been internalized. The timing mattered. Institutions were built to respond deliberately. But deliberation now meant delay, and delay meant distance. Those who had begun to read, to interpret, to weigh meaning personally, did not experience these responses as guidance. They experienced them as reaction. The church reaffirmed what it had always taught. It defined boundaries it had long assumed. But the act of definition itself signaled that those boundaries were no longer self-evident. On this night, authority still carried weight. Yet its words arrived after understanding had already formed. Late responses do not reverse change. They acknowledge it. And in doing so, they reveal that what once required no defense now requires declaration. The attempt to restore control made visible what silence had hidden. That unity now had to be maintained actively because it no longer existed naturally. As responses multiplied, their tone shifted. Earlier authority had relied on assumption. Now it relied on definition. Where belief had once been guided by shared understanding, it began to be enforced through regulation. Rules appeared where persuasion had once sufficed. Statements grew more precise. Boundaries were drawn more sharply. This was not cruelty. It was necessity. When unity no longer arises naturally, it must be maintained deliberately. The church clarified doctrine not because it wished to control more, but because it sensed control slipping. Persuasion requires trust. Rules require compliance. As interpretation diversified, trust could no longer be assumed. On this night, many accepted these rules willingly. They offered clarity in a moment of uncertainty, but rules change the nature of belief. They shift faith from shared conviction to required conformity. And conformity, once demanded, signals that agreement is no longer expected. The move from persuasion to regulation marked a quiet admission. Authority was no longer guiding belief alone. It was now protecting it. And protection, unlike persuasion, reveals vulnerability. As regulation replaced persuasion, belief became increasingly tied to authority's reach. Where agreement could no longer be assumed, obedience was required. Rulers aligned with doctrine. Laws echoed theology. Faith and governance began to overlap more visibly. This alignment was not accidental. In a fragmented landscape, power offered what belief alone no longer could: uniformity. Confessional positions were enforced through political structures. Religious boundaries hardened along lines of jurisdiction. Belief became something protected by courts, by penalties, by decree. This did not restore unity. It preserved order. On this night, many accepted this shift as necessary. Power brought clarity. It stabilized communities. It reduced visible conflict. But belief enforced by power is different from belief sustained by trust. It demands compliance where conviction may be absent. The Church did not abandon persuasion, but it now relied on authority beyond theology to maintain coherence. And once faith depends on power to endure, it signals that unity has moved from shared understanding to enforced alignment. The attempt to restore control had succeeded in one sense. The world did not fall apart, but it could no longer return to the quiet unity it once inhabited. As belief became regulated, it also became territorial. Faith no longer moved freely across borders. It settled where power enforced it. Rulers began to define belief within their own domains. What was taught in one territory was restricted in another. Religion and governance aligned not out of theological clarity, but out of necessity. A ruler required unity. Belief offered it, if it could be fixed. Church authority alone could no longer guarantee coherence. Political authority supplied what remained missing: enforcement. This did not create peace. It created boundaries. Belief became local, shaped by jurisdiction rather than inheritance. On this night, faith was no longer universal in practice. It depended on where one lived, which authority ruled, and which interpretation was permitted. Europe did not collapse under this shift. It reorganized. Unity gave way to alignment. Belief followed power. And once religion becomes tied to political authority, faith can no longer claim to belong equally everywhere. It belongs where it is upheld. As religion aligned with political authority, states themselves began to take shape around belief. Faith was no longer only a matter of conscience or inherited tradition. It became a marker of governance. Territories adopted confessional identities, not because belief was suddenly unanimous, but because uniformity was required to rule. What one believed became linked to where one belonged. A subject's faith signaled loyalty. Deviation suggested disorder. This arrangement simplified control. Rulers could enforce religious alignment as a means of maintaining stability. Belief became administratively legible. The state did not replace the church. It partnered with it. Together, they defined acceptable belief within defined borders. On this night, this development did not feel revolutionary. It felt pragmatic. Europe did not dissolve into chaos. It organized itself differently. Confessional states offered structure in place of universal unity. But this structure came at a cost. Belief, once inherited across borders, was now constrained by them. And once faith becomes tied to territory, it ceases to be universal in practice, even if it remains universal in claim. As belief became territorial, it also became a measure of compliance. Faith was no longer only about salvation. It was about order. To believe correctly meant to align with the authority that ruled. Deviation was interpreted not simply as error, but as refusal. Religious conformity offered visibility. It allowed rulers to know who belonged and who did not. Obedience and belief merged quietly. To accept the sanctioned faith was to accept governance itself. To question it was to invite scrutiny. This connection reshaped experience. Belief became public in a new way, not through confession, but through alignment. People learned which words were safe, which practices were expected, which interpretations could be expressed. On this night, many accepted this arrangement as protection. Order replaced uncertainty. Boundaries replaced ambiguity. But faith tied to obedience changes its meaning. It asks not only what do you believe, but will you comply? And when belief is measured by obedience, it no longer rests entirely on conviction or conscience. It rests on visibility. Europe did not collapse. It adjusted. But belief, once shared across space, now followed authority, and obedience became the language through which faith was recognized. As belief settled into borders, Europe did not shatter. It rearranged itself. The old map, drawn by shared faith, faded gradually. In its place emerged a landscape defined by alignment rather than inheritance. Religious boundaries began to mirror political ones. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but increasingly. A traveler could sense the shift. Worship sounded familiar, yet not identical. Scripture was honored, yet interpreted within local limits. The continent remained connected by culture, by memory, by language. But it was no longer unified by belief. This new map did not announce itself with ceremonies or declarations. It became visible through practice, through what could be said, through what could not, through which questions were permitted and which were silenced. On this night, Europe still felt whole. Trade continued, diplomacy endured, cities stood. Yet beneath this continuity, the spiritual geography had changed. Faith no longer flowed freely across the continent. It settled where it was upheld, defended, and enforced. The world had not ended. It had been redrawn. And once redrawn, no authority, spiritual or political, could restore the map that had existed before. Epilogue. The morning after unity. Morning did not reveal ruins. Churches still stood in their places. Stone unchanged, bells intact, altars prepared as they had been for generations. There was no visible mark to distinguish this day from the last. Candles were lit. Prayers were spoken. The familiar order resumed. To an observer, nothing had fallen. The same buildings anchored the towns. The same symbols framed devotion. The same rituals carried meaning forward. History had not announced its passage through destruction. It had passed through continuity. This familiarity mattered. It allowed change to settle without resistance. It reassured those who feared disorder that the world remained intact. On this morning, unity appeared preserved because its structures remained. But structures do not guarantee sameness. They can endure while meaning shifts within them. The churches still stood. What they represented had already begun to change. The rhythm of the day did not change. Bells still marked the hours. The calendar still guided the year. Feasts and fasts arrived on schedule, unchallenged and unquestioned. People moved through familiar motions, standing, kneeling, listening, as they always had. Ritual continued to do what it had always done: provide structure, offer reassurance, carry memory forward. There was comfort in this repetition. It suggested that nothing essential had been disturbed, that faith remained stable, even if its meaning had begun to shift. Ritual does not ask questions. It preserves continuity by design. On this morning, that continuity felt necessary. It allowed communities to remain whole, even as understanding varied within them. It softened the edges of change by keeping form intact. But ritual can only carry so much weight. It sustains belief when belief is shared. It stabilizes experience when meaning aligns. As those conditions changed, ritual continued. Faithful, precise, unchanged, even as the ground beneath it quietly moved. Nothing in the service signaled division, yet the repetition itself was beginning to serve a different purpose. Not to express unity, but to preserve calm in a world where unity was no longer certain. Work resumed as expected. Fields were tended. Markets opened. Contracts were honored. Families gathered. Children learned prayers. Elders repeated what they had always known. Nothing in daily life demanded a new explanation. The world still functioned. People measured time by the same signs, trusted the same routines, and relied on the same institutions to make life predictable. Change had not arrived as disruption. It had arrived as background. This outward continuity mattered because it concealed transformation. When life continues smoothly, meaning can shift without resistance. No one felt compelled to choose a side. No one was asked to name what had altered. On this morning, the Reformation was not experienced as a break in daily existence. It was experienced as normality, and normality has power. It allows history to move forward without calling attention to itself. The world appeared unchanged because the structures of life still held. But history does not require upheaval to take effect. It requires only that understanding no longer returns to its previous shape. The day unfolded as it always had. The night had already done its work. What had changed was not immediately visible. It existed beneath habit, beneath ritual, beneath the language of continuity. Faith was no longer received without awareness. For centuries, belief had arrived as inheritance, unchosen, unquestioned, as natural as place of birth. Now it required recognition, not public declaration, not formal selection, but inward agreement. To believe meant to accept, personally, what had once been assumed collectively. This did not feel like freedom. It felt like responsibility. Faith no longer rested entirely on family, community, or institution. It asked something of the individual: attention, discernment, and consent. On this morning, most people would not have named this shift. They would still say they believed as they always had. Yet belief now carried awareness, that it could have been otherwise, that understanding mattered, that conscience had entered the space once occupied only by obedience. Inheritance had not disappeared, but it no longer operated alone. And once faith becomes something that must be inwardly accepted, it can never fully return to being merely received. With faith no longer inherited without question, authority could no longer claim universality in the same way. The Church still spoke with confidence. It still asserted continuity with the past. Its structures remained intact, but its reach had changed. Authority no longer arrived as the unquestioned voice for all believers everywhere. It spoke within boundaries, geographical, political, and experiential. Belief now intersected with jurisdiction, with conscience, with interpretation. This did not eliminate authority. It localized it. The idea of a single voice capable of settling belief across all of Western Christendom had quietly passed. On this morning, that loss was not mourned. No announcement declared the end of universality. No ceremony marked its departure. yet its absence was felt in how belief was practiced and enforced. Authority could still command obedience. It could still define doctrine, but it could no longer assume that its voice would be received identically everywhere. And once authority loses universality, it becomes one influence among others. Powerful, enduring, but no longer singular. What followed was not harmony, but coexistence. Belief no longer resolved into a single form. It settled into multiple expressions, each claiming continuity, each grounded in sincere conviction. This plurality did not begin as tolerance. It began as fact. Different understandings existed because they could no longer be prevented from existing. Communities learned to live with difference as a condition, not as a choice. Faith became descriptive rather than universal. One believed here in one way, there in another. This did not end devotion. It altered its shape. Religious life continued, but it no longer pointed toward a single center. It pointed inward and outward, along paths that did not always meet. On this morning, plurality had no name. It was not yet defended or celebrated. It was simply present. And presence is enough to change the future. Once multiple faithful ways of believing exist side by side, the world cannot return to a single inherited certainty. The morning after unity did not bring peace or conflict. It brought a new condition, one in which belief, having fractured quietly, would continue to shape history through difference rather than sameness. The significance of this night does not rest in doctrine alone. It rests in what followed. When faith moved inward, when authority lost its universal reach, when belief required understanding, the structure of Western thought began to change. Truth was no longer received exclusively from above. It was encountered, examined, and weighed. This shift did not belong only to religion. It reshaped how knowledge itself was approached. Ideas could be questioned without dissolving order. Disagreement could exist without immediate collapse. The habit of personal engagement, first with scripture, later with law, with philosophy, with governance, found its earliest testing ground here. On this night, no one spoke of modernity, yet the conditions that would make it possible were already in place. A world in which authority could be examined, a world in which belief involved consent, a world in which understanding mattered. This did not make the future inevitable. It made it imaginable. And imagination, once permitted, rarely remains confined. From this quiet shift emerged a lasting idea. That belief carries personal responsibility. Conscience, once secondary to obedience, became a legitimate place where meaning was formed. This did not eliminate authority. It altered how authority was received. Individuals learned to measure what they were told against what they understood. This habit did not remain confined to faith. It shaped how people related to law, to power, to tradition. The sense that one must answer inwardly before submitting outwardly took hold gradually. On this night, conscience was still fragile, still uncertain, still unnamed. Yet it had entered the structure of belief. And once conscience becomes part of faith, it becomes part of identity. The modern emphasis on moral responsibility, on personal conviction, on the right and burden of choosing, finds one of its earliest roots here. Not in rebellion, not in protest, but in the quiet moment when belief could no longer rest solely on inheritance. What endured after this night was not division alone. It was a new relationship between the individual and meaning. Belief could no longer be carried entirely by institution, by tradition, or by silence. It required engagement. This did not make belief easier. It made it heavier. To believe became an act that involved attention, reflection, and responsibility. This shift would shape centuries to come. It would influence how people questioned power, how they approached truth, and how they understood freedom. Not as absence of structure, but as participation in meaning. On this night, no one chose this future deliberately. It arrived through accumulation of words read, of silence endured, of conscience awakened. The world did not fall apart. It changed direction. And that change did not announce itself with noise or violence. It arrived quietly, in the space where belief could no longer remain someone else's responsibility.